When you think of famous, smart people who believed in the Christian God, my guess is a lot of you probably think first of some famous Christian smart people. People like Isaac Newton or Thomas Aquinas, who lived in a time and place where basically everyone was Christian, so the existence of the Christian God was just kind of taken for granted. So you might be surprised to find out that there was one very famous smart person who did not live in a Christian society at all, and yet believed in something that looks remarkably similar to the God of Christianity. And that person is Aristotle. Now, I'm going to assume that you've heard of Aristotle before.
Have you ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes.
Morons.
But I'm going to guess that a lot of you probably don't know much about what Aristotle thought. Aristotle is easily one of the most important philosophers of history. Someone so smart that even his side work as a scientist set the gold standard in science for almost 2,000 years. But of course, his main work was in philosophy, and it was through philosophy that Aristotle came to believe that God exists. But before we get into how Aristotle came to believe in God, let's talk about why it's really interesting that he did. Aristotle was raised in ancient Greece. His Greece was the Greece of Alexander the Great, of ancient democracy, of comedy and tragedy, of long robes and almost as long beards, and most importantly, of Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, Hermes, Hades, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Phaistos, and Dionysus. A Greece filled by tall statues of these beings and even taller temples to house them, where sacrifice was offered to these gods on a regular basis. A Greece, in other words, that was unabashedly and unambiguously pagan. Aristotle almost certainly would have had no contact with anyone who believed in anything like the Christian God. Monotheism, especially monotheism which professed an infinite, eternal, immaterial God who sustains the entire world in existence, would have been utterly unheard of. Yet that is exactly the kind of being that Aristotle believed must exist. Aristotle was led to believing in God by thinking about change. Change, Aristotle argued, was a real feature of the world. And I think he's right about this. Don't believe me? Let me prove it to you. A minute ago, I was wearing a gray polo shirt and had no hat. Now, I'm wearing a New England Patriots shirt and I have an Uncle Sam hat on. Looks like change exists to me. So change exists. That sounds like no big deal, until you realize that there were people in Aristotle's time who were claiming otherwise. The most famous of these was a guy named Parmenides. Parmenides argued that change can't exist, because when a thing changes, it gets some new feature seemingly out of nowhere. And it's a basic philosophical principle that something cannot come from nothing. Therefore, Parmenides concluded that change was absolutely impossible, and that all the change we think we see around us when I wave my hand from here to here, or when I go outside or change my clothes, is actually just all an illusion. Aristotle was not very happy with this idea because he cared about common sense. For Aristotle, it was enough to stand up and start doing jumping jacks to prove that change exists. Parmenides' position was just too out of touch with common experience to be true. But Aristotle was a philosopher, and he wasn't satisfied with saying, "You're wrong, Parmenides, now go touch some grass," and leaving it there. He had to find out where Parmenides went wrong. And it is in doing this that Aristotle discovered God. You see, Aristotle's solution to Parmenides' problem was to say that change is not really something coming from nothing. Instead, it's something coming from a potential, which is this kind of an in-between stage between something and nothing. Potentials exist in things, but they don't come to the fore until they're given actuality, or realness, by an already real thing. So whenever we see a thing change, we know that some potential in a thing is being made actual or given actuality by an already actual thing. And you see, this explains how change is possible, because it means that change doesn't really entail something coming from nothing, but something coming from a potential. And by the way, while this view might seem a little out there at first, it's actually very commonsensical once you strip away the technical jargon. Basically, Aristotle's saying that things have things that they can do and things that they can't do. That there is something in a thing that allows it to turn into one thing, to change one way, but to not change in other ways. When you look at it that way, Aristotle's notion of a potential is actually very intuitive. That being said, it does raise another question, namely, where do things get their actuality from? If one potential thing is made actual by an actual thing, the natural follow-up question is, where did that actual thing get its actuality from? Either that actual thing has actuality of its own nature, or it doesn't. But if it doesn't, then it must get its actuality from something else, something outside it. There must be something else sustaining the actuality of that thing, keeping it from falling back into merely potential, even as it's keeping another thing from falling back into mere potential. But if the thing which is giving actuality to the thing that's giving actuality to the thing that's giving actuality to the first thing we talked about is itself the kind of thing that can change, then we have to ask where it's getting its actuality from. Either this goes back to infinity, or there exists something which doesn't get its actuality from anything else, something which just has actuality of its very nature. And Aristotle argues that option 1, saying that everything that exists just has actuality derived from something else back to infinity, doesn't work, because if that was the case, we would still have no explanation for how actuality got into the system in the first place. It would be like if you had a really long train of boxcars with no locomotive at the front. Without the locomotive, without something that has the power to act of its own nature and not derived from another thing, there would be no way for a train to move. Or, in this case, no way for anything to give anything else actuality. But we know that things do give each other actuality because, as we said earlier, change exists, and change is a potential becoming actual. Therefore, option 2 must be right, and there must exist something which has actuality of its own nature, something which just is actuality with no potentials, and changes other things without itself being the kind of thing that can change. Aristotle calls this thing the unmoved mover, because it moves the changing things of the world without itself being moved. And it's this unmoved mover of Aristotle that I'm arguing is remarkably similar to the idea of God held in Christianity, and even more remarkably, by ancient Judaism from before the time of Aristotle. Consider here some of the major attributes of the Judeo-Christian God. God's infinite, immaterial, he's timeless, he's eternal, he's unchanging, he's perfectly good, he's a creator, and he's personal. I'm going to argue that we can find echoes of every single one of those attributes in Aristotle's unmoved mover. Let's start with the most obvious one. The unmoved mover is, well, unmoved. That means that it doesn't change. This is something that the Old Testament explicitly teaches about God, and that God teaches about himself in the Bible, saying, I, the Lord, do not change. The unmoved mover is also immaterial for Aristotle. That's because material things are necessarily subject to change, and the unmoved mover can't be changed. So when the Old Testament suggests that God is not part of the physical material world, but stands as its creator, separate from it, it's paralleling ideas that Aristotle would teach about the unmoved mover centuries later. Aristotle's unmoved mover is also eternal and outside of time, because Aristotle believed that time is a measure of motion and change, and so the unmoved mover could not be subject to time because it can't change. The unmoved mover also, as a purely actual being with no potentials, must be infinite, because if it had limits, those limits would place a potential on it, and to not have limits is just the very definition of being infinite. Aristotle also called his unmoved mover a living being, who was most good, the only being that does not depend for anything else for its existence, and serves as an end for all human action. This, again, closely parallels the Judeo-Christian notion of God as an all-good personal being. Finally, the unmoved mover is, in a sense, a creator. While it's true that Aristotle didn't believe that the world had a beginning in time, he imagined the unmoved mover as sustaining the things in the world in existence by providing them with actuality. So, for Aristotle, everything that exists is dependent for its existence on the unmoved mover. While not exactly the same notion of creation found in the opening chapters of Genesis, Aristotle's view of the unmoved mover gives his ultimate being a unique role in causing the world to exist, similar to that given to God in Judeo-Christian theology. So putting this all together, we find that Aristotle independently thought his way to the existence of a being who is unchanging, immaterial, infinite, eternal, timeless, perfectly good, personal, and responsible for the world existing as it does. I don't know about you, but I find this really, really interesting. That someone with no ideological axe to bend in favor of Christianity, someone who existed entirely independent of the context of monotheistic religions, was able to think his way to the existence of a very Christian-looking God is quite remarkable, and suggests that belief in God is not just a product of where people grow up, but that the reasons for thinking that God exists are strong enough that a good philosopher could become convinced of them just on their own merits. And if you want to slightly fuller treatment of this subject, I recommend you check out a Substack post that I recently put up on my Substack. Also, if you've liked this video, please consider liking this video and also subscribing to my channel to help me grow and reach more people. Thanks for watching this video, and God bless.